All right, let's go. Number 10. The strangers around the granary. In the Loess Hills of Shanxi Province in central China, there is a Neolithic village called Quanhucan. 5,500 years ago, the people there belonged to the Yangshao culture, one of the great early farming societies of East Asia. They grew foxtail millet. They stored it in pits dug into the ground, and they built their lives around the harvest. Beginning around 2001 and continuing through later excavation seasons, archaeologists working the site recovered animal bones from the village deposits ordinary refuse from an ordinary settlement. Among the pig bones and the deer bones were the bones of cats. 8 of them, from at least 2 animals, sealed in layers dated to roughly 5,300 years ago. A cat in a farming village is not by itself a mystery. What made these bones worth years of study was the relationship between the grain the farmers stored and the animals that came to steal it. The pits at Quanhucan show the pressure of rodents. Some of the pottery vessels were shaped deliberately to keep small animals out with narrow mouths and heavy-fitted lids. The people were losing part of every harvest to creatures that burrowed toward the stored millet, and that loss is the oldest reason a wild cat has ever had to move closer to a human settlement. Where there is stored grain, there are rodents, and where there are rodents, there is a predator willing to tolerate people in order to hunt them. The analysis that made Quanhucan famous came from a team that included Hu Yaowu in China and the zoo archaeologist Fiona Marshall at Washington University in St. Louis. They measured the carbon and nitrogen isotopes locked into the cat bones, a chemical record of what each animal had eaten across its life. The signal was clear. These cats had been eating animals that themselves ate millet. They were living off the rodents that were living off the human grain. The relationship archaeologists had always assumed the cat drawn in by the pests around a granary was now written into the bone chemistry of specific animals from a specific village at a specific moment in the deep past. One of the cats carried a stranger signal. Its isotopes suggested it had eaten less meat than a pure hunter would, and more of the millet-based food that humans and their animals were consuming, as though it had been scavenging scraps or fed by hand. And it was old. It had survived to an age that a wild cat exposed to predators and starvation rarely reaches, and it had done so in a place surrounded by people. Something at Quanhucan had made room for a cat and let it grow old there. Then the bones were examined again. A separate study published a few years later re-identified the remains not as the wild cat that would become the house cat, but as the leopard cat, a small spotted feline native to East Asia and only distantly related to our own. That single reclassification changed the meaning of the whole find. The bargain at Quanhucan was real. Farmers made room for a hunter. The hunter stayed, and for a while the two species shared the same edge of the same fields. But that particular lineage led nowhere. It did not become the animal on the modern windowsill. What Quanhucan preserves is not the birth of the house cat. It is a photograph of the same idea occurring on its own thousands of miles from the Near East, and then quietly ending. The pits are still there, in the yellow soil of Shanxi. The relationship they recorded did not outlive the species that began it. Number 9. Hierakonpolis. On the west bank of the Nile, about 17 kilometers north of the town of Edfu, lies one of the most important sites for understanding Egypt before the pharaohs. Hierakonpolis was a major center in the Predynastic period, older than the pyramids by more than 1,000 years, a place where the ideas that would become dynastic Egypt were still taking shape. In the elite cemetery, there cataloged by archaeologists as HK6, the powerful were not buried alone. Around their graves lay the bones of animals, and the range of them is astonishing. Cattle and baboons, hippos and hartebeest, even an elephant, and among them, cats. The dating places these burials in the Naqada period, roughly 3,700 years before the Common Era, close to 5,700 years ago. The animals form what can only be described as a managed collection, a menagerie of power assembled by an elite that could command the capture, the feeding, and the keeping of dangerous and difficult creatures. The cats are the reason the site belongs in this countdown, and one cat in particular carries the whole argument on the evidence of its own skeleton. Its bones had been broken, and they had healed. A small cat recovered from the cemetery had suffered fractures in its limbs, and the breaks showed the smooth remodeling that only happens when a bone knits back together over weeks of immobility. That single detail does more work than any inscription. A cat with a broken leg in the wild does not survive. It cannot hunt. It cannot climb to safety. It cannot escape a predator. For those fractures to heal, the animal had to be held still and fed by something that wanted it to live for the month or more that bone repair requires. The break is not evidence of injury. It is evidence of care. The work at Hierakonpolis was carried out across many seasons by researchers, including the zoo archaeologist Wim van Neer and the site's longtime director, René Friedman. In one pit, they found 6 cats buried together, 2 adults and 4 kittens. The kittens belonged to 2 separate litters, born at different times to different mothers. That combination is very difficult to explain as the chance capture of wild animals. It looks instead like people were holding cats in captivity, keeping them long enough and well enough that the cats bred, and then placing the resulting animals in the ground alongside the human elite when the elite died. Nothing about this was easy, and that is what makes it meaningful. Wild cats do not tolerate confinement gladly, and keeping a breeding group of them alive and fed alongside baboons and hippos and an elephant required knowledge, resources, and intent. The menagerie at HK6 was a statement of power, a demonstration that its owners could bend even dangerous and untamable animals to their will. The cats began in Egypt not as objects of affection, but as symbols of control. Yet the healed bones complicate even that reading because control does not require mending a broken leg. Somewhere inside the display of power, someone was also keeping a small animal alive for its own sake more than 1,500 years before the first temple to a cat goddess would ever be raised. What Hierakonpolis does not offer is tenderness. These cats were part of a funerary display buried to accompany the powerful into death, and some of them were almost certainly killed in order to do it. This is not yet the cat curled at the foot of a bed, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But it is the moment the relationship becomes physical, deliberate, and impossible to dismiss. Someone confined a cat and fed it while its broken leg mended. Someone kept a breeding group of an animal that does not easily submit to being kept. The healed bone still sits in a collection, a small remodeled fracture that records a decision made on the banks of the Nile 57 centuries ago, long before anyone carved a goddess in the shape of a cat. Number 8. The cats that came 2,000 miles. In the Krakow-Częstochowa upland of southern Poland, there is a long band of limestone riddled with caves. People have sheltered in them, buried their dead in them, and hidden in them for tens of thousands of years, and the cave floors preserve a layered archive of everything that passed through. In 4 of these caves, archaeologists recovered the bones of cats. That alone should not be remarkable. Europe has had a native wildcat since long before the first farmers. But when the bones were studied closely, they did not belong to it. Magdalena Krajcarz, a researcher at Nicholas Copernicus University in Torun, led the analysis that separated the two. The European wildcat and the Near Eastern wildcat are close cousins, but they can be distinguished in the fine anatomy of the skeleton and in the chemistry locked in the bone. The cats in the Polish caves were the Near Eastern kind, the lineage native to the Fertile Crescent, and North Africa, the true ancestor of the domestic cat. And the oldest of them dated to around 4,200 years before the Common Era, close to 6,000 years ago. Thousands of years before anyone in Europe would have recognized a house cat. The distance is the heart of it. These animals, or the parents and grandparents that carried their lineage, had come from the Near East more than 2,000 miles to the southeast. They had not crossed that distance as wild predators steadily expanding a range. They had traveled with people along the same corridors that carried farming itself into Europe. When the first agricultural communities pushed out of Anatolia and up through the Balkans and into the heart of the continent, they did not travel alone. Their grain drew rodents, the rodents drew cats, and the cats followed the farmers into a land that already had a wildcat of its own, arriving as passengers on the greatest migration in European prehistory. Krajcarz and her colleagues read the diet of these immigrant cats from the isotopes in their bones, and the result was careful, and it resisted easy sentiment. The animals were eaten rodents tied to human fields and grain stores, but they were not fully dependent on people. They hunted the pests around the settlements, and they also hunted in the wild, moving freely between the two worlds and belonging entirely to neither. They were not pets. They were commensal animals sharing the human table without ever being invited to sit at it, taking what farming made available and giving nothing in return that anyone had asked for. This is the least sentimental entry in the countdown, and one of the most important, because it captures a stage the warmer stories tend to skip. The cat entered Europe thousands of years before anyone would have called it tame, riding the slow expansion of agriculture like a stowaway in the hold. These particular animals were an early incursion, a wave that arrived and thinned out long before the domestic cat would sweep across the continent in earnest many centuries later on the ships and roads of a very different world. What the Polish caves preserve is the road not yet a partnership, the long middle passage in which a wild predator lived at the edge of human life, taking advantage of it without ever giving itself over to it. The native European wildcat still hunted the same forests, and for a time, the two kinds of cat shared the continent, close relatives keeping their distance from each other and from us. The caves preserved the moment the ancestor first walked into Europe, still wild, still keeping its distance, carrying inside it everything the animal would one day become. The bones lie in the limestone dark, 2,000 miles from the country, where their lineage began at the start of a journey that was not yet a partnership. Number 7. Bubastis. In the eastern Nile Delta stood a city the Egyptians called Perbast, the House of Bastet, which the Greeks later wrote as Bubastis. It was the cult center of a goddess who took the form of a cat, and for much of the first millennium before the Common Era, it was one of the most important religious sites in all of Egypt. The Greek historian Herodotus, who claimed to have visited, described its annual festival as the most crowded in the country, drawing enormous throngs by river to celebrate the cat goddess with music, wine, and rejoicing. What archaeology found in the shadow of such centers was not devotion in the abstract. It was cats in numbers almost impossible to hold in the mind. They were mummified, wrapped in linen, dried, sometimes gilded or painted with faces, and offered to the goddess by pilgrims. Cat mummies were produced across Egypt on a scale with no equal anywhere in the ancient world. At the cemetery of Beni Hassan and at sites up and down the Nile, they were found stacked in underground galleries, hundreds of thousands at a time. The scale reached the point of absurdity in the late 19th century, when a single shipment of roughly 180,000 cat mummies was carried from Egypt to England and ground up for fertilizer. The sacred dead of a civilization sold by the ton and scattered across English fields. A few skulls were kept, most simply dissolved into the soil of another country. The scale is the part that unsettles. When researchers, among them the Egyptologist Salima Ikram, unwrapped and x-rayed these mummies, a grim pattern emerged. A great many of the cats were young, only a few months old, killed before they had finished growing. And many of them showed the same lethal injury, a neck that had been deliberately broken or wrung. These were not for the most part beloved companions who died of old age and were honored in death. They were bred for the purpose, raised in temple catteries, in vast numbers killed young, and sold to worshippers who offered them to Bastet, the way a person elsewhere might light a candle or leave a coin. An entire industry of the sacred running on the mass production and mass killing of cats. What makes this significant is not the cruelty, though the cruelty was real. It is the consequence. To supply that demand, Egyptians had to keep and breed cats deliberately, generation after generation in captivity at an industrial scale that pulled the animal completely into the human economy. Cats had to be housed, fed, protected, and bred by the tens of thousands, and a population managed that intensely for that long is a population being shaped by human hands, whether anyone intended it or not. The religion that killed cats by the million is paradoxically part of the same machinery that fixed the domestic cat as a permanent fixture of human life and prepared it to spread beyond Egypt's borders. The evidence of that reverence still fills museum cases. The bronze statues of Bastet's cats survive elegant and upright and serene, some with gold rings in their ears, made with a care that speaks of real love for the animal's form. And the mummies survive too. in drawers and storerooms around the world, small wrapped bundles that were once living kittens. Both things are true at once. In Egypt, the cat became a god, and being a god very nearly destroyed it. The devotion and the slaughter were the same act. And out of that contradiction, the animal we know walked forward into the wider world. Number 6. The harbor that buried its cats like children. On the Red Sea coast of Egypt lie the ruins of Berenike, a port founded in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and busy for centuries afterward as a gateway for trade between the Mediterranean world and Arabia, India, and the lands beyond. Ships came into its harbor, loaded with pepper and gemstones, incense and fine cloth, the luxuries of half the known world, passing through a town at the desert's edge. And on the outskirts of that hard commercial settlement in the early centuries of the Common Era, the people of Berenike did something no one expected. They made a cemetery for their animals. The animal cemetery at Berenike was excavated over several seasons by a team led by the Polish archaeologist Marta Osipinska, and what it held changed the emotional register of the entire subject. Across the excavation, the team documented the remains of hundreds of animals, dogs and monkeys, and above all cats, each one placed carefully in the sand in what is now recognized as one of the earliest true pet cemeteries known anywhere in the world. These cats had not been mummified for a goddess. They had not been killed as offerings and sold to pilgrims. They had been laid in the ground the way a person lays down something they cannot bear to simply throw away. Careful study of the bones showed that many had lived full lives and died of natural causes. The ordinary fate of a well-kept animal, rather than the early death of a sacrifice. The details are what carry it past doubt. Many of the cats were placed on their sides legs drawn up toward the body in the exact posture of a sleeping animal. Some were buried wearing collars, including one of iron, and some with necklaces strung from glass beads and pieces of ostrich eggshell. Some of the cats were old, and some bore healed injuries, the marks of animals that had been nursed through illness and age, rather than discarded the moment they stopped being useful. One small cat had been laid in its grave beneath the wing of a large bird, as though someone had tucked it in. These are not the burials of working animals kept for the rats in a warehouse. The detail that changes the story is the beads. A cat used only to protect grain does not need a necklace of ostrich shell, and a dead pest controller does not get laid on its side like a sleeping child. Adornment and posture are not utility. And here they are not religion either, because these animals were not offerings to anything. What remains once you strip away the practical and the sacred is the plainest and most human explanation. These cats were companions, and their people grieved them, and the grief left a trace in the only medium the archaeological record reliably keeps, which is the care taken with a body after death. Berenike matters because it closes the last avenue of doubt. It is possible to argue that a cat in a granary was merely tolerated, that a cat in a temple was merely used, that a cat in a painting was merely a symbol. It is not possible to argue that a cat buried in a bead necklace on its side under a bird's wing was anything other than loved. The port itself is long dead, its trade routes closed, its harbor filled with sand, its name nearly forgotten by history. The small graves remain deliberate and gentle at the edge of a vanished town, a working harbor at the rim of an empire, stopped again and again to bury its cats with tenderness. 2,000 years later, the beads are still around their necks, exactly where someone placed them. Number 5. The cat beneath the chair. Around 1350 years before the Common Era, in the height of Egypt's New Kingdom, a scribe and grain accountant named Nebaman had a tomb chapel decorated in the necropolis at Thebes. Its walls were painted with the life he intended to carry into eternity, a banquet with musicians, herds of cattle, a garden pool ringed with trees, and a scene of Nebamun himself standing in a slender reed boat hunting birds in the marshes. Fragments of these paintings now hang in the British Museum, and they are among the most beautiful images to survive from the ancient world. Low in the papyrus of the marsh scene in the middle of the flushed and scattering birds, there is a cat. It is not a symbol tucked away in a corner. The cat is in the thick of the action, caught mid-leap in the reeds, gripping birds in its claws and its jaws, all at once, and its eye has been finished with a leaf of gold. In a wall of ochre and green and river blue, the animal's eye is the one element the artist chose to gild the single point of true brightness in the whole composition. Scholars still debate exactly what the cat is doing there, whether it is helping the hunt standing in for older religious ideas about cats in the marshes, or simply present as the household animal that belonged at its owner's side, even in the afterlife. The debate itself is telling. The cat is woven so deeply into the scene that its meaning has more than one layer. Egyptian tomb painting is not a snapshot of a passing moment. It is an inventory of a life, a careful listing of the things a person wanted to keep, forever assembled to be made real again in the world beyond death. And across the tombs of the New Kingdom, one of the things people chose to keep is the cat. It appears again and again in a particular place beneath the chair of the tomb's owner. Very often the chair of the wife sitting or eating from a bowl or gnawing a bone, sometimes tethered by a ribbon to the chair leg. In the visual language of these scenes, under the chair is where a member of the household belongs. A child sits there. A cherished animal sits there. The cat is placed in exactly the position reserved for the intimate life of the family. What makes the cat beneath the chair remarkable is how completely ordinary it has become. By Nebaman's time, cats in Egyptian art are no longer a wonder or a novelty to be explained. They are simply part of the furniture of domestic life as expected under the chair, as a jar of wine is on the table or a servant is at the door. The Egyptians even had a word for the animal that echoed the sound. It made a soft onomatopoeic name, and they gave cats to their households as a matter of course. Somewhere between the caged menagerie of Hierakonpolis and the painted marshes of Thebes, across roughly 2,000 years, the cat crossed a line that no single image announces. It stopped being a thing that had to be captured and kept, and became a thing that was simply assumed to be there in the picture. A man commissioned of the life he loved enough to want for all eternity. The gilded eye is the detail that stays with you longest. Of all the colors mixed for the marsh scene, the artist reserved actual gold for the cat's eye alone, spending the most precious material on the wall on a house animal crouched in the reeds. Whatever that cat was to the people who painted it, it was worth more than pigment. The bird hunt ended 33 centuries ago, and the man who commissioned it has been dust for longer than most civilizations have existed. The gold in the cat's eye has not dimmed. Number 4. The lineage that crossed the sea. For a long time, the story of how the cat spread across the world could only be told through bones and burials, and the bones could carry the story just so far. A cat skeleton in a European village might be a native wildcat or an imported domestic, and the difference between them is often too fine to read from the shape of a jaw. The question needed a different kind of evidence, and in 2017, it arrived in force. A team of geneticists, including Claudio Ottoni, working with the paleogenetics specialists, Eva Maria Geigel, and Thierry Grange, published the largest study of ancient cat DNA ever attempted, reading the maternal genetics of more than 200 animals across 9,000 years, from Stone Age sites to Egyptian mummies to the ports of medieval Europe. The DNA sorted the spread of the cat into two great waves, each marked by a distinct maternal lineage passed down the female line. The first came out of Southwest Asia and moved north and west into Europe, with the earliest farmers the same slow agricultural tide that had carried cats into the Polish caves thousands of years before. The second lineage came out of Egypt, and it spread later, and crucially it spread by sea. It followed the shipping lanes of the classical Mediterranean, carried aboard vessels as living protection for cargo, and stores against rats radiating from the Egyptian coast across the ancient world in the centuries around the beginning of the Common Era. Cats had become part of the standard equipment of a ship, and ships went everywhere. Then, the same Egyptian lineage turned up in a Viking harbor. Among the samples was a cat, carrying the Egyptian maternal signature, recovered from a trading port on the Baltic coast of what is now northern Germany, dated to the Viking Age, a full 1,000 years after Egypt's ships first began carrying cats out into the Mediterranean. The descendants of Egyptian ships' cats had reached the cold northern edge of Europe, riding the trade routes of an entirely different people in an entirely different age. The animal had become a permanent passenger on human history going wherever the cargo went threading at itself along every route that people opened between one part of the world and another. The study surfaced one more finding, and it is a quiet correction to something almost everyone believes. The blotched, swirling coat of the classic tabby. The marbled pattern. Most people picture the moment they picture a cat does not appear in the ancient record at all. It shows up only in the medieval period, more than 1,000 years into the era of the domestic cat. For all the millennia before that, the cats that lived alongside humans wore the mackerel stripes of their wild ancestors camouflaged, like the animal that first crept toward the granaries. The familiar tabby swirl is a recent thing, a change written into the fur long after the animal had already joined the human world. The value of the study is that it turned a guess into a map. The routes the cat traveled, the harbors it passed through, the thousands of years it took to cross from the Nile to the Baltic, are now legible in the genes of living animals. A cat asleep on a windowsill in northern Europe carries coiled inside its cells the record of a voyage that began on the coast of Egypt and never really ended. The bones told us the cat had arrived. The DNA told us how and by what long sea road, and reminded us that the animal in the house has been a traveler far longer than it has been a resident. Number 3. The discovery that arrived too late. For most of the last 2 decades, the origin story of the domestic cat felt essentially settled. It began in the Fertile Crescent around the dawn of agriculture, drifted gradually toward Egypt, and radiated outward over many thousands of years. A long, slow slide from wild rodent hunter to household companion. Nearly every earlier entry in this countdown was arranged in the older tellings to support that comfortable arc. Then, in 2025, a cluster of new studies took much the same bones and much the same DNA, gathered far more of it, and reached a sharply different conclusion. Researchers including Marco Di Martino, the archaeologist Sean Doherty at the University of Exeter, and Claudio Ottoni assembled a far larger and more tightly dated body of feline remains from across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, and subjected it to close genetic and chronological analysis. When they lined the specimens up by age and by lineage, the pattern that emerged pulled the whole timeline forward. In their reading, the fully domestic cat, the animal genetically and behaviorally distinct from the wild populations around it, does not appear early and does not creep in gradually. It appears in Egypt, and it spreads across the Mediterranean and into Europe far more recently than anyone had assumed, largely within the first millennium before the Common Era, in 2 comparatively swift waves out of North Africa. But here's where the timeline breaks. If the true domestic cat is a late and largely Egyptian creation, then a great deal of the older evidence has to be read again with different eyes. The famous cat buried on the island of Cyprus, long celebrated as the oldest domestic cat in the world, is reinterpreted in this work not as a domestic animal at all, but as a tamed European wildcat, a separate and much earlier experiment that led nowhere in genetic terms. The Chinese leopard cats were already known to be a dead end. One after another, the early milestones are recast as false starts and independent attempts, and the origin of the animal we actually keep is pushed forward into the age of Egyptian temples, Egyptian ships, and Egyptian gods. The proposed engine of that domestication is the most provocative part of the claim. These researchers argue that the decisive pressure may not have been agriculture at all, but religion. The mass breeding of cats for the cult of Bastet, the same relentless industry that killed them by the million, may have been precisely the force that reshaped the wildcat into a truly domestic animal and then flung it outward across the sea on the trade networks that Egypt commanded. In that version of events, the goddess did not merely receive the cat as a gift. She may have manufactured it generation by generation in the catteries of her temples as a side effect of a demand for sacred offerings. Not everyone agrees, and the disagreement is worth stating plainly. Other researchers point out that commensal cats, the wild animals living around farms and towns, are genuinely hard to separate from fully domestic ones in the archaeological record, and that a later date for genetic domestication does not erase the thousands of years of cats and people already sharing space before it. What is confirmed is that cats were present in human settlements for a very long time. What is newly argued is that the animal became truly domestic much later, and much closer to Egypt than the older consensus held. What would settle it is exactly what the authors ask for: more ancient genomes more precisely dated, spread across the regions where the story is thinnest. What is clear either way is that the tidy old story no longer holds. The safer conclusion now is that the domestic cat is younger than we long believed, more Egyptian in its making than we thought, and more entangled with ritual and death than with the gentle picture of a farmer feeding a friendly stray. The bones in the ground did not change. The reading of them did, and the new reading arrived late enough and forcefully enough to unsettle nearly everything that had been built on the old one. Number 2. The animal that changed almost nothing. Lay the skeleton of the cat from an Egyptian tomb beside the skeleton of a cat that died on a road last week, and you will struggle to tell them apart. Set the skull of a modern house cat next to the skull of a wild Near Eastern one, and the differences are so slight that specialists have to argue over them. This is the quiet anomaly sitting at the center of the entire story, and it sets the cat apart from almost every other creature that human beings have ever taken into their lives. Domestication normally leaves a deep mark on the body. The dog diverged from the wolf into 1,000 shapes, shortening its snout, curling its tail, collapsing, and swelling across breeds until the wolf inside it is almost impossible to see. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses were all remade by human control, their frames bent to human purposes across the generations, their bones reshaped so consistently that archaeologists can use those changes to date the very moment a species crossed from wild to tame. The cat refused to play along. 10,000 years of living beside us have barely touched its skeleton. In its body, the house cat is still very nearly the wild cat. It descended from the same size, the same build, the same lethal architecture of a small solitary hunter. What makes this difficult is that it forces a completely different definition of what happened here. The cat was not rebuilt. It was not bred for meat or milk, for wool or muscle, or labor not selected into new forms to serve some human need, because the cat never had a job that required changing its body. The only service it offered was killing the rodents. It wanted to kill anyway, and that asked nothing of its shape. The change that domestication worked on the cat was therefore almost entirely invisible, because it happened in behavior rather than in bone. When the genome of the domestic cat was sequenced and compared with its wild relatives, only a small handful of regions showed the fingerprints of real selection, and several of them are tied to fear, to reward, to memory, to the neural wiring that governs whether an animal flees a human or approaches one. The wild cat runs. The tame one stays. The distance the animal would allow between itself and a person shrank, and almost nothing else did. This is why so many researchers now describe the cat as the animal that domesticated itself. No one set out to design it. The wild cats that could tolerate the presence of humans prospered around human grain, and human refuse bred with each other, rather than with the shyer animals that kept away, and slowly over thousands of years sorted themselves into a population that chose to remain. We did not trap the cat and remake it in a shape of our choosing, as we did with nearly everything else in the barnyard. We simply created the conditions, a world of settlements, and stored food, and steady scraps, and the animals that could bear our company selected themselves, one tolerant generation after another, into the creature now asleep on the windowsill. The consequence is a companion that never truly surrendered. The cat lives inside our homes, carrying the almost complete body of a wild predator, altered in temperament and in little else, still fully equipped to walk out the door and survive without us. The bond that made it ours is real, but it was written so lightly that it left no fossil, no shortened jaw, no shrunken brain. Case, no change a future archaeologist could point to and call the signature of domestication. The deepest relationship in this entire countdown is marked in the end by the near total absence of a mark. The cat came to live with us and consented to nothing but our nearness. Everything else about it stayed wild. Number 1. The grave dug for 2. At a Neolithic site called Cambos on the island of Cyprus, there is a grave. In 2001, a team led by the French archaeologist Jean-Denis Vignier of the National Museum of Natural History in Paris uncovered a burial pit dated to roughly 9,500 years ago, which makes it older than the pyramids, older than Bubastis, older than every other site in this countdown by thousands of years. In the pit lay a human being, laid to rest with the things that mattered. Polished stone tools, worked flint seashells, and a scattering of red ochre. And 40 centimeters away, in the same grave carefully and deliberately placed, lay the complete skeleton of a cat. The cat had not been eaten. There were no butchery marks on any of its bones. None of the cuts and breaks that mark an animal used for food. It was a young animal, only about 8 months old, and it had been arranged in the grave in the same orientation as the person, its head pointing the same way, close enough that a hand could have rested on it. 2 bodies, one human and one feline, buried together on purpose at the very dawn of farming in the eastern Mediterranean, thousands of years before Egypt existed as an idea. Chalorocambos was not a shrine or a temple. It was an early farming settlement, one of the first on the island, a place of roundhouses and wells, and the ordinary work of people learning to live off planted fields on ground where no one had farmed before. The cat bones scattered elsewhere in the site show that these were not the only felines the community kept. But this grave is the one that speaks, because a bone in a rubbish layer tells you an animal was present, while a body laid gently beside a person tells you what the animal meant. The detail that lifts this from touching to astonishing is a matter of simple geography. Cyprus is an island, and it has no native wildcats. There were no cats on Cyprus for anyone to find, tame, or bury. The only way a cat could possibly be lying in that grave is if human beings had put a living animal into a boat, taken it out onto the open sea, and carried it across from the mainland of the Near East to an island many hours from any shore. Someone more than 9,000 years ago decided that a cat was worth the danger and the difficulty of a sea crossing, brought it deliberately to a new land, kept it there, and when a person died, chose to lay the animal in the earth beside them so that neither would be alone. But here's where the grave becomes something more than a record of taming. The recent reappraisals, the same 2025 work that dragged the domestic cat's true origin forward into the age of Egyptian temples, suggests that this Cyprus animal may not have been a domestic cat in the strict biological sense at all. It may have been a tamed wildcat, an experiment that led nowhere down the genetic line, a branch of the story that flowered once on a single island and then closed. By the exacting definition of the geneticists, the oldest pet cat in the world might not qualify as a house cat. And it does not matter. The genetics can tell us which lineage prevailed and which one quietly died out. They cannot touch what this grave actually records. Whatever species that 8-month-old animal belonged to, whatever label a modern laboratory would assign it. Someone carried it across the sea, kept it close, and could not imagine burying a loved one without it lying alongside. The question of category is a modern argument conducted in a language no one at that graveside would have understood. The act itself is 9,500 years old, and it is not ambiguous in the slightest. A person and a cat were placed in the ground together, 40 centimeters apart, facing the same direction because, to the people standing at the edge of that pit, the two of them belonged together in death as they had in life. Everything else in this countdown is evidence of a process, the long machinery by which a wild hunter became a permanent human companion. Rodents in granaries in China, healed bones and caged menageries. In Egypt, isotopes in Polish caves. Mummies by the million ostrich shell beads at a desert port. Gold leaf on a painted eye. 2 lineages threading across the sea, a change so slight it left no trace in the skeleton. All of it explains how the cat came to live with us. Chalorocambos explains nothing. It is not evidence of a process at all. It is evidence of a feeling, long before the goddess, before the temples, before the ships, and the trade routes, and the swirling tabby coat. A single human being on a small island decided that a cat was family, and proved it in the only language a grave will ever speak. The bones still lie exactly where they were placed. The person and the cat have kept each other company now for 9,500 years, and neither one has moved. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.